Can I sleep on your porch tonight? Just for tonight, she said quickly, her voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the cold wind. Just one night, sir. I promise. I don't need to come inside. I just need to stay in that corner of the porch where the wind doesn't hit so hard. I'll be gone before sunrise. Annie Brooks jolted upright so fast she nearly lost her balance. One hand slammed against the freezing stone floor of the porch while the other clutched the torn edge of her coat as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling apart. She pulled her knees close to her chest, her shoulders trembling, her wide eyes fixed on the man standing in the doorway. Richard Whitmore froze, one hand still gripping the door he had just opened. The cold air rushed over him, making him shiver. He wore only a sweater over his dress shirt, car keys in one hand and his wallet in the other. He had been about to drive to his usual late-night diner for eggs, toast, and black coffee, because tonight, like so many other nights, he couldn't sleep. Good Lord, he muttered softly. The cold stung his nose. He inhaled sharply, then again, suddenly embarrassed when he realized he had wiped his nose with the back of his hand like a child. Who are you? He asked, his voice rough with surprise. And why are you curled up outside my front door? I almost stepped on you. I'm sorry. Annie tried to stand, but her legs barely worked. She pushed herself halfway up before collapsing back down, still hugging herself tightly. I didn't mean to scare you. I wasn't trying to break in or anything. I just saw the porch light was on. Richard glanced past her toward the long driveway leading to the mansion. The iron gate at the end of the road was still closed. How did you get through the gate? It was slightly open when I got here. She swallowed hard. Maybe somebody forgot to shut it all the way. I swear I didn't take anything. I never said you did. Yes, sir, she answered too quickly. The porch light illuminated her face clearly. A young black girl. Richard lowered his keys. What's your name? She hesitated for a moment. You're sitting on my porch, he said. I think I at least deserve to know your name. Annie Brooks. How old are you, Annie? 18. Richard let out a slow breath. 18. Old enough for the law to call you an adult, but still far too young to be left out in the cold. Something flickered in Annie's eyes. My mother's at work, she said quietly. And your father? My stepfather. The word carried a weight she tried and failed to hide. Richard studied her silently for another moment. Where does your mother work this late? At Street Ann's Care Center on Maple Street. She picked up an extra shift. She usually does that when rent is due. And your stepfather is home? Annie's fingers tightened around the frayed edge of her coat. Yes, and he's drunk. Richard nodded slowly. He drinks almost every night, Annie continued, exhaustion heavy in her voice. But tonight was worse than usual. I got off work late. After school, I bussed tables at a barbecue place near campus. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, and dinner still wasn't made. She lowered her head. My mom usually leaves food for me if she can, but tonight she had to leave in a hurry. I was going to cook later. I just hadn't gotten to it yet. And he got angry. He started yelling before I even took my coat off. Annie swallowed hard. He called me lazy, said my mother worked herself to death while I couldn't even put food on the table. He said if I thought I was grown because I was 18, then I could go out and live like an adult. She stared down at the freezing porch floor. Then he threw me out. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. Then why not go back and cook for him? He asked, his voice blunt and cold. Make him dinner and sleep in your own bed. Why lie out here in the cold on a stranger's porch? His words sounded harsh, but his eyes did not. Annie looked up at him quickly, trying to decide whether he was mocking her or testing whether she was telling the truth. I can't. Why not? Because my mother isn't home. Her voice trembled. And he didn't just yell. He threw things. He said if I wanted to act like an adult, I could get out and survive like one. She took a shaky breath. I called my mother, but she couldn't answer because she's not allowed to use her phone while working. I tried waiting outside until he calmed down, but then he locked the door. Richard's expression changed immediately. Annie noticed. I knocked one more time, she continued softly. He yelled through the door that if I knocked again, he'd call the police and tell them I was trying to break in. She lowered her eyes, so I left. I didn't know where else to go. My phone died. The buses had stopped running. I just kept walking. You don't have any friends? No one close enough for me to show up at their door after midnight. What about neighbors? Annie let out a bitter little laugh. In our building, people hear everything and just turn their TVs up louder. Richard looked out into the dark yard before turning back to her. You know what this looks like, don't you? He asked quietly. Annie nodded before he even finished speaking. Yes, sir. A young black girl lying on the porch of a wealthy white man in Lakewood Hills after midnight. His voice dropped lower. If someone sees you here, it could become a problem. For you, and for me. I know. You could have knocked on another door. There are plenty of houses on this street. I know. Then why mine? Annie looked embarrassed. Because your porch light was still on. Richard paused. That's it? Your house was the only one with the light still on. Her voice softened. The others looked asleep already. Richard didn't know how to answer that. Inside the house, the grandfather clock struck midnight. Please. Annie's voice shook from both cold and humiliation. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, trying to make herself smaller. I'm not asking for much, just a corner. I won't touch anything. I won't make any noise. If it makes you uncomfortable, I can even stay far away from the door. Richard remained silent. I tried calling my mother. I tried going back. She looked up at him, exhaustion and fear written across her face, though she still struggled to hold on to the last pieces of her dignity. I even thought about walking to the gas station, but there were men hanging around out there. I didn't know if that would be safer or worse. Her voice cracked. Tonight, I really don't have anyone else. She pointed toward the far corner of the porch where the wind curled around the brick columns. I can curl up over there, she whispered. You probably won't even notice I'm here. But before Richard could respond, a shout suddenly rang out from the end of the driveway, tearing through the stillness of the night. Annie. Her entire body went rigid. Richard turned sharply toward the gate. A man was stumbling toward them, grabbing the fence to keep from falling before forcing himself forward again. He wore a filthy work jacket over a wrinkled t-shirt, sagging jeans, and unlaced work boots. Even from a distance, Richard could see the drunken sway in every step he took. Annie, the man shouted again. Did you really think I wouldn't figure out where you ran off to? Annie's face turned pale. Richard glanced at her. Is that him? She gave a small nod. The man climbed onto the porch, breathing heavily. The smell of whiskey, cigarettes, and sweat hit the cold air immediately. Well, well, he sneered, spreading his arms. That didn't take long, did it? Annie instinctively backed away. Ray, don't do this. Don't do what? He snapped. Don't ask what the hell you're doing on some rich white man's porch in the middle of the night. Richard stepped forward, positioning himself between Ray and Annie. You both need to lower your voices. Ray shot him a defiant look. You need to stay out of other people's family business. This is my house. Ray blinked, then let out a mocking laugh. Oh, your porch. He nodded sarcastically. Nice porch. Now tell the girl to get up. She's coming home with me. Annie's voice was barely above a whisper. You locked me out. I told you to get out because you were mouthing off. I wasn't. You're always talking back. Ray pointed at her, his fingers shaking from the alcohol. Just like your mother. Always tired, always working, always acting like I'm the problem. Richard stared directly at him. You threw an 18-year-old girl out into the cold. Ray turned toward him instantly. She's 18, isn't she? Old enough to disrespect me, old enough to take care of herself. She said her mother is at work. Linda works just to make me look useless. He curled his lip bitterly. Women always do that. Run around telling everyone how exhausted they are so people will feel sorry for them. Ray took another step up the porch. Richard didn't move. Don't come any closer, he said calmly. Ray laughed again, but this time the confidence in it had faded. What are you gonna do? Call security? He mocked. Or call the cops and explain why you're hiding another man's girl on your porch. She's not your daughter, but she lives in my house. And you locked her out. She can come back when she learns some respect. Annie struggled to stand, still clutching her coat tightly around herself. Ray, just let me go. Please don't make a scene. Richard tilted his head slightly toward her. Annie, sit down. Ray's expression darkened instantly. Don't tell her what to do. I'm telling you what not to do. The long driveway suddenly fell into a heavy silence. Somewhere beyond the trees, the sound of tires rolling across the road drifted through the night before fading into the darkness. Ray's eyes moved from Richard's sweater to the brightly lit foyer behind him. He glanced over the expensive house, the carefully polished brass decorations, and the quiet authority of a man who never had to raise his voice to be heard. "You think having money makes you better than other people?" Ray asked. "No. You think just because she came running here crying, you suddenly know what's going on? I know she asked if she could sleep on my porch tonight because she had nowhere else to go." Ray snorted. "She's good at acting. Her mother taught her that. The black women in that family can cry on command whenever it helps them get what they want." Annie lowered her head. Richard's expression changed slightly. Not much, but enough to notice. A quiet irritation flickered across his face. "You can insult me all you want," Richard said. "But you will not stand on my property and talk about her mother like that." Ray opened his mouth, then closed it again. Richard's calmness seemed to confuse him more than anger would have. "Annie," Richard said, still staring directly at Ray, "did he hit you tonight?" Ray snapped, "Don't answer that." Annie's lips parted, but no sound came out. Even so, Richard understood the answer. "Did he throw anything at you?" Ray took another step forward. Richard slipped a hand into his pocket and pressed a button on his key remote. Somewhere along the side of the house, a security light suddenly switched on, flooding the driveway and front steps with harsh white light. Ray stopped cold. "I told you not to come any closer," Richard said. Ray narrowed his eyes against the brightness. "You trying to scare me?" "No, I'm just making sure the camera gets a clear shot of you." For the first time, Ray looked up and noticed the small black security camera mounted beneath the roof beam. His jaw tightened. Richard continued, "You can leave right now. You can walk down my driveway, go home, sober up, and wait for Linda to call you. Or you can stay here yelling at a frightened girl in front of a camera until I decide to call the police." Ray turned toward Annie. "You hear that? This guy thinks he's saving you. You really think he cares? Men like him don't care about people like us. He'll get tired of you before sunrise." Annie said nothing. Ray pointed at her again. "Go home right now. Otherwise, don't ever come back." Annie's face stiffened, but this time she didn't move. Richard saw it. Ray saw it too, and that silence made Ray angrier than any argument could have. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. "Fine," he hissed. "Stay with him then. Let's see how your mother handles losing both of you." He backed down the porch steps, nearly stumbling on the last one before catching himself. He muttered curses under his breath, then turned and staggered down the driveway, shouting back toward the house as he went. "This isn't over, Annie." Neither Richard nor Annie spoke until Ray's footsteps finally disappeared beyond the gate. Richard waited a few more seconds, listening carefully to make sure the man was truly gone. Then he turned to Annie. She still hadn't moved. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, and her eyes remained fixed on the dark driveway, as if Ray might step back out of the shadows and drag her away the moment she looked elsewhere. On the other end of the line, Linda Brooks took a shaky breath. "Annie, are you hurt?" "No, Mama." "Did he touch you?" Annie glanced toward Richard before answering. "No." That pause said enough. Linda lowered her voice. Annie could hear her walking somewhere quieter inside the nursing home. The noise of rolling carts and televisions faded behind her. "I'm coming to get you," Linda said. "Mama, you're working." "I don't care. You need this shift." "I said I'm coming." Richard turned off the stove burner beneath the soup pot and finally spoke. "Miss Brooks?" There was hesitation on the phone. "Yes? My name is Richard Whitmore. I know who you are." Her voice carried embarrassment the way tired people carried grocery bags silently, because they were too used to the weight. Richard leaned lightly against the counter. "Your daughter is safe here." "I'm sorry," Linda said immediately. "I'm so sorry she bothered you." Annie shut her eyes. Richard noticed. "She didn't bother me. She shouldn't have been wandering around at night. She shouldn't have been locked out." Silence, not angry silence. "The heavier kind," Linda finally said, very quietly. "No, she shouldn't have." Richard looked at Annie while her mother spoke. The girl sat curled beneath the blanket, trying to disappear into the chair even now. She ate slowly, carefully, like someone trained not to finish too much of another person's food. "How far are you from here?" he asked. 20 minutes maybe, if I leave now. Then drive carefully. There's no emergency anymore." Linda gave a tired little laugh that almost broke in the middle. Feels like there's been one for years. Richard did not answer that because he understood it too well. I'll be there soon, she said. After the call ended, Annie placed the phone down gently, almost respectfully, before pulling the blanket tighter around herself. She sounds nice, Richard said. She's tired. That too. Annie stared into the soup. She's always tired. Richard poured himself coffee from the machine near the counter. It had been sitting there since earlier that evening, dark and bitter. He drank it anyway. She works doubles often? Whenever somebody calls out sick. Annie rubbed at the cracked skin near her knuckles. People at the care center quit a lot. Mama says old people deserve better than rushed workers. So she stays. She likes the job. She likes the patients. Annie shrugged. Not the paychecks. Richard leaned against the counter again. And you work after school? After classes, yeah. You still in school? Community college. She hesitated. Part-time. What are you studying? Nursing. The answer came quietly, almost like she was embarrassed by wanting something expensive. Or trying to. Richard nodded once. My wife was a nurse, he said. Annie looked up for the first time in several minutes. Really? She used to come home exhausted and still somehow complain more about bad coffee than sick people. A small smile touched Annie's face before disappearing again. She sounds nice, Annie said. She was. The kitchen grew quiet after that. Richard studied the girl without making it obvious. Everything about her suggested caution. The way she sat near the edge of the chair. The way her eyes flicked toward every sound in the house. The way she apologized before doing anything, even lifting the spoon too loudly against the bowl. People weren't born like that. Something made them become careful. You can relax a little, he said. Annie immediately straightened. I am relaxed. Richard almost smiled into his coffee. That's unfortunate. That earned him another brief smile, this one real enough to soften her face for a second. Then headlights swept across the front windows. Annie's shoulders tensed instantly. It's probably your mother, Richard said. I know, but she still looked frightened. Richard set down his mug and walked toward the foyer. Annie stood quickly, nearly tangling herself in the blanket before catching it against her chest. The front door opened before he reached it. Linda Brooks stepped inside wearing pale blue scrubs beneath a winter coat she had clearly thrown on in a hurry. Her face looked exhausted in the way only middle-aged working women could look exhausted deep into the bones, beyond sleep. Her hairnet was still tucked halfway beneath her curls. One sneaker lace was untied. Her hospital badge hung crooked against her chest. The moment she saw Annie, she crossed the foyer fast enough to almost slip on the polished floor. Oh, baby. Annie stood up so quickly the chair legs scraped the tile. Linda wrapped both arms around her daughter and held her hard. Annie stayed stiff for 1 second, maybe 2, then folded into her mother like something finally allowed to stop standing upright. I'm sorry, Linda whispered against her hair. I'm sorry I didn't answer. You were working. I should have answered anyway. Mama, I should have answered. Richard quietly stepped back toward the kitchen, giving them space. But Linda pulled away first and looked at him with immediate embarrassment. Mr. Whitmore, I am so sorry for all this. You've said that already, and I mean it every time. You don't owe me an apology because somebody treated your daughter badly. Linda lowered her eyes. Still, Richard noticed her hands before anything else. Dry from sanitizer. Red across the knuckles. One wrist wrapped in a cheap pharmacy brace. Working hands. The kind his own mother once had before arthritis bent them sideways. You came straight from work, he said. I left in the middle of a shift. She looked ashamed of even that. I never do that. Tonight seemed like a reasonable exception. Linda glanced toward the windows, toward the driveway beyond them. Did Ray come here? He did. Her face closed immediately. I'm sorry, she whispered. Richard frowned slightly. Why do you keep apologizing for his behavior? Linda opened her mouth, then stopped. People who live too long around anger learn to apologize before anyone asked them to. Annie looked down at the floor. Richard saw both of them do it at nearly the same time. You two eaten? He asked. Linda blinked. What? Food. Have either of you eaten dinner? Annie shook her head. Linda gave a tired little laugh. I had crackers from a vending machine around 6. Richard walked back toward the stove and picked up the soup pot again. Well, Martha's soup can survive feeding 3 people. Linda looked confused. You don't have to. I know. That stopped her. For a moment, nobody spoke. The kitchen lights glowed softly over the counter while cold pressed quietly against the windows outside. Annie sat back down slowly, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Linda took the chair beside her, close enough that their elbows touched. Richard set another bowl on the table, and for the first time in a very long while, the kitchen sounded less like a house occupied by one lonely man, and more like a place where people actually lived. Linda held the warm bowl between both hands for a long moment before taking the first bite. Richard noticed she ate the way exhausted people did, carefully at first, like their body no longer trusted comfort to last. This is good, she said quietly. Martha made it, Richard replied. I just reheated it. She cooks for you? She complains about me and cooks anyway. Apparently that's loyalty. Linda smiled faintly at that. Annie sat beside her mother beneath the blanket, shoulders finally beginning to loosen now that Ray was no longer outside yelling through the dark. The house had settled into silence again, not the cold silence from before, but something softer. The ticking grandfather clock carried down the hallway. Somewhere upstairs, the heater clicked on. Richard poured more coffee into his mug. Linda looked around the kitchen carefully, almost nervously. You really live here alone? Yes. In this whole place? That seems to surprise everybody tonight. Linda shook her head slowly. No offense, Mr. Whitmore, but this kitchen's bigger than our whole apartment. Richard leaned against the counter. That sounds less like an insult and more like a problem with the apartment. Linda laughed under her breath before catching herself, as though laughing in a rich man's house might cost money. Annie noticed it too. Mama hasn't slept properly in like 3 years. Annie. It's true. Linda rubbed her forehead tiredly. I sleep. You pass out sitting up for 2 hours and call it sleeping. Richard watched the exchange quietly. The way Annie spoke around her mother was different. Softer. Less guarded. He realized the girl had probably spent years trying to become another adult inside that apartment because there had not been enough room for her to stay a child. What time does your shift normally end? He asked Linda. 6 in the morning. And you left in the middle of it. I'll probably catch hell tomorrow. You work tomorrow too? Linda gave him a look that answered before she spoke. I work every day except Sundays. Annie stared down at her soup again. Richard noticed. What? He asked. Nothing. That usually means something. Annie hesitated. Mama was supposed to have tomorrow morning off. Linda sighed softly. Annie, you are gonna sleep in for once. I still can. No, you can't. Ray's probably already breaking stuff. The room went quiet. Linda lowered her spoon slowly. The exhaustion in her face seemed to deepen all at once. Richard spoke carefully. Do you need to go back there tonight? Linda answered too quickly. Yes. Annie immediately shook her head. No. Baby, our things are there. He's drunk. He's always drunk. That's not better. Linda looked embarrassed now, not defensive. Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate everything you've done already. But we can't stay here. Richard studied her for a moment before answering. I didn't ask you to decide anything tonight. That's still your house. And it's midnight. Linda opened her mouth, then closed it again. Richard continued calmly. You're exhausted. Annie's freezing. Neither of you should be driving back to an apartment where a drunk man is waiting to scream at everyone. He'll calm down by morning. Richard took a sip of coffee. Maybe. Or maybe he'll wake up angry. You embarrassed him. Linda looked away because she knew that possibility too well. Annie's voice lowered. Mama, I don't want to go back there tonight. That finally did it. Not the fear. Not the humiliation. Just the quiet honesty in her daughter's voice. Linda pressed her lips together and stared at the table for several seconds before nodding once. Just tonight, she whispered. Richard set down his mug. Good. Linda looked up immediately. We can sleep on the couch. You can sleep in actual beds. No, sir, we really don't. I have 6 empty bedrooms upstairs. If I let 2 people sleep folded like laundry on my couch while those rooms sit empty, Martha will probably quit tomorrow out of disgust. That earned a tired laugh from Annie. Linda still looked uneasy. We don't want to impose. Richard glanced around the giant kitchen. Trust me. This house has survived worse things than company. He walked toward the hallway and motioned for them to follow. Annie stood first, wrapping the blanket tightly around herself before helping her mother up. Linda moved slowly now that the rush of panic had worn off. Richard noticed the stiffness in her shoulders, the slight limp in her right leg, long shifts, concrete floors, cheap shoes. As they walked upstairs, Annie stayed close behind her mother like she was afraid the house might change its mind halfway there. The second floor was quieter, softer, somehow. Framed family photographs lined the walls beneath warm lamps. Annie slowed when she noticed them. A younger Richard stood smiling beside a woman with dark curls and kind eyes. Between them was a teenage girl holding a birthday cake crookedly toward the camera. Annie stopped without meaning to. "That your family?" she asked quietly. Richard followed her gaze. "Yes." The answer was short, but something inside it made Annie look away again. He opened the first guest room. It held a queen bed, pale cream walls, a reading chair near the window, and blankets folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Linda stopped in the doorway. "This room's bigger than my apartment. That says more about your landlord than my guest room." She let out another tired laugh. "You'll sleep here," Richard said. "Annie can take the room across the hall." Annie immediately shook her head. "No, Mama should take the bed. I can sleep on the floor." Richard looked at her. "Nobody's sleeping on a floor tonight. I don't mind. That concerns me more than it reassures me." Linda touched Annie's arm gently. "Baby, just take the room." Annie hesitated, then nodded. Richard opened the second room across the hallway. Smaller, blue walls, bookshelves near the corner, the bed neatly made, though no one had touched it in years. Annie stepped inside carefully. Something changed in Richard's face when he looked at the room. Not dramatic, just quieter. Linda noticed. "Was this?" She stopped herself. Richard answered anyway. "My daughter's room." Silence settled softly around all three of them. Annie immediately stepped backward. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "It's all right." "No, I shouldn't." She would have hated the idea of somebody sleeping cold downstairs while this room stayed empty. Annie looked at him for a long moment, unsure whether grief was something she should step around or something already living permanently in the walls. Richard reached for the light beside the door. "Bathrooms at the end of the hall. There are clean towels inside." Linda folded her hands tightly together. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you." Richard gave a small nod like gratitude embarrassed him slightly. "You can thank me tomorrow," he said. "Tonight you both need sleep more than manners." He turned to leave, then paused halfway down the hallway. "Oh," he said without looking back. "There's bacon, eggs, and toast downstairs if either of you wake up hungry before morning. Martha buys enough food for a football team because she thinks I forget meals on purpose." Annie managed the smallest smile yet. "Do you?" "Frequently." "Why?" Richard glanced toward the dark staircase. "House gets too quiet sometimes." Then he continued downstairs, leaving the two women standing beneath the warm hallway lights while the cold stayed outside where it belonged. Richard stayed downstairs long after the house went quiet. The coffee in his mug had gone cold again, but he drank it anyway while standing near the kitchen window, looking out across the dark lake behind the house. The security lights still glowed near the driveway. Beyond them, the neighborhood slept peacefully behind trimmed hedges and expensive silence. Upstairs, two people who did not belong there were finally warm. That thought settled strangely inside him. He walked through the kitchen slowly, straightening things that did not need straightening. Old habit. Restless people always found reasons to keep their hands busy. He rinsed the soup bowls, loaded the dishwasher halfway, then stopped because Martha would complain he stacked plates like a divorced raccoon. The sound almost made him smile. Almost. At 1:30 in the morning, the house should have felt empty again. Instead, he kept listening for footsteps upstairs. He finally turned off the kitchen light and headed toward the staircase, but halfway there he noticed a small figure sitting near the top step. Annie. She was wrapped in the blanket, knees pulled close, her torn coat folded beside her. Under the softer upstairs light, she looked younger than 18. Tired enough to forget pretending otherwise. Richard stopped at the bottom step. "You planning to sleep there?" Annie startled slightly. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. That seems to be becoming a theme tonight." A tiny smile appeared and disappeared again. "You couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "The room's too nice." Richard blinked once. "That's a new problem." "I mean..." Annie looked embarrassed trying to explain it. "Everything's quiet." No TV yelling, no doors slamming, no people fighting through the walls. I keep thinking somebody's going to start screaming any minute. Richard leaned one shoulder lightly against the banister. Your body got used to noise. Yeah. And now silence feels suspicious. Annie looked surprised. Exactly. Richard nodded slowly. Happens more than people think. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Annie glanced downstairs. You don't sleep much either, huh? No. Bad dreams? Sometimes. She studied him carefully. About your daughter? Richard looked up at her. The question should have felt rude. Somehow it didn't. Yes, he said after a moment. Annie lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. Don't apologize for things you didn't do. She nodded faintly. Richard climbed halfway up the staircase and sat on one of the wide wooden steps, leaving space between them. The house remained still around them. What was she like? Annie asked quietly. He let out a slow breath through his nose. Messy, loud, thought every rule I made was personally designed to ruin her life. That drew another small smile from Annie. She played music too loud in her room, left cups everywhere, borrowed money constantly. His expression softened slightly. Best person I ever knew. Annie pulled the blanket tighter around herself. I think nice people always leave stuff behind. Richard glanced at her. Meaning? My grandma used to say cruel people leave damage, nice people leave space. She shrugged. Like, memories people still want to sit beside. The sentence landed harder than she realized. Richard looked away toward the dark hallway. You close with your grandmother? He asked. She died when I was 12. I'm sorry. She used to braid my hair while watching old church shows on TV. Annie smiled faintly at the memory. She smelled like peppermint and lotion. Sounds like a good grandmother. She was. Annie hesitated. Mama changed after she died. Meaning? She got tired faster. Annie picked at a loose thread on the blanket. Then bills started stacking up. Then Ray moved in because he said he'd help. He was different back then. Richard made a quiet sound that was not quite agreement. He used to bring flowers home, Annie said. Now he mostly brings beer. Silence settled again. Downstairs, the heater kicked softly through the vents. Annie looked toward the guest room where her mother slept. Mama's gonna go back to him. Richard watched her carefully. You sound sure. She always says it'll calm down eventually. Annie swallowed. People get used to surviving stuff they shouldn't. Richard sat with that for a moment. Then he asked, What do you want? Annie looked confused. Not what your mother wants. Not what Ray wants. You. Nobody had asked her that in a long time. He could tell by how long it took her to answer. I want to finish nursing school. She gave a small shrug. I want to sleep one whole night without listening for yelling. I want Mama to stop apologizing every 5 minutes. Her voice softened. I want her to laugh like she used to. Richard nodded once. That sounds reasonable. Annie laughed quietly through her nose. Not where I'm from. Richard studied her face in the dim light. Smart girl. Careful girl. Too careful. The kind of carefulness poverty and fear built slowly over years until it settled into a person's bones. You hungry again? He asked suddenly. Annie blinked. What? You ate half a bowl. I didn't want to seem greedy. You're 18. 18-year-olds eat like raccoons in national parks. That startled a real laugh out of her this time, quick and surprised. There it is, Richard said. What? You sound your age when you laugh. The words embarrassed her immediately. She looked down again. Richard stood carefully from the step. Come on. Where? Kitchen. You serious? I'm too old to joke this late at night. A few minutes later, they sat at the kitchen island eating toast with scrambled eggs. Richard barely remembered how to cook. Annie watched him scrape burned pieces from the pan. You're not good at this, she said carefully. I'm aware. You cook like somebody going through a divorce. I did go through one technically. Death is very committed paperwork. Annie choked on a laugh. Richard handed her orange juice while pretending not to notice. By the time they finished eating, some of the tension had finally left her shoulders. Richard rinsed the plates while Annie folded the blanket neatly over the chair. You don't have to clean, he said. I know, but you're doing it anyway. She shrugged lightly. Feels wrong not to. Richard dried his hands with a kitchen towel and looked at her for a long moment. You know, he said, the first thing most people notice in this house is the money. Annie glanced around the kitchen. And the second? How quiet it is. She nodded slowly. Then, before either of them could say another word, a violent pounding shook the front door downstairs. Both of them froze. The pounding came again, harder this time, and Ray's voice roared through the house. "Annie!" The pounding hit the front door again. "Annie!" The sound rolled through the house hard enough to make Annie flinch. The plate in her hand rattled softly against the counter before she set it down too quickly. Richard looked toward the foyer, then back at her. "He's drunker now," Annie whispered. Another slam shook the door. "Open this damn door." Upstairs, a bedroom door opened sharply. Linda appeared at the top of the staircase, still half wrapped in the guest room blanket, panic already in her face before she even spoke. "Oh, God." Ray pounded again. "Linda, I know you're in there." Richard's expression changed completely then. The softness left it. Not anger exactly. Something colder, controlled. "Stay here," he said. Linda hurried downstairs anyway. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry. You need to stop apologizing every time that man behaves badly." The words came out firmer than before. Linda stopped halfway down the staircase. The pounding came again. "You really gonna hide in there with him?" Annie instinctively moved closer to her mother. Richard noticed both of them doing it without thinking. He walked calmly toward the foyer, while unbuttoning the cuffs of his shirt sleeves once each, a slow, practical movement. Annie watched him with confusion. "You're not calling the police?" she asked quietly. "Not yet." Ray slammed the door again. "I ain't leaving." Richard unlocked the deadbolt. Linda's eyes widened. "Please be careful." Richard opened the door only halfway. Cold air rushed inside. Ray stood on the porch swaying slightly, face flushed red beneath the security lights. His jacket hung open now despite the weather. One hand held an empty beer bottle by the neck. "Well, there he is," Ray said loudly. "Thought maybe rich people sleep through other folks' families getting destroyed." Richard's eyes dropped briefly to the bottle. "You need to leave. That girl belongs with her mother. Her mother is inside." Ray blinked once, thrown off by the answer. Then Linda stepped into view behind Richard. Ray's expression shifted immediately. Linda, not softer, just different. Like a man suddenly remembering which mask usually worked best. "Baby," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "You really gonna embarrass me like this?" Linda folded her arms tightly across herself. "You locked Annie out. You know I didn't mean it. You threw a plate at the wall. That plate missed everybody." Annie closed her eyes briefly. Richard noticed. Ray pointed toward Annie over Richard's shoulder. "She twists everything." Richard stayed where he was. "You need to go home." Ray ignored him completely now, eyes fixed on Linda. "I came all the way out here walking in the damn cold looking for y'all. You came here drunk. I had a few beers. You can barely stand up." Ray looked wounded by that. "So now you taking his side?" Linda laughed once, exhausted more than amused. "Ray, there shouldn't be sides in a house where a child got locked outside. She ain't a child anymore. She's our daughter." That word hung in the air. Even Annie looked surprised by it. Ray noticed too. His face hardened instantly. "Now she's your daughter? Funny. Usually she's just another bill you complain about." Richard opened the door slightly wider and stepped outside onto the porch, forcing Ray back one pace without touching him. "That's enough." Ray stared at him. "You enjoying this?" "No." "You think because you got money, women trust you?" "No." "Then what's your angle here?" Richard looked at him for a long second before answering. "My angle is that an 18-year-old girl asked to sleep on my porch because she was scared to go home." Ray laughed harshly. "Scared of what?" Nobody answered. The silence made him louder. "I fed that girl, kept a roof over her head." Linda spoke quietly. "By my paychecks." Ray snapped toward her. "You saying I never did nothing?" "I'm saying I'm tired." Something in those 4 words landed harder than shouting would have. Ray stared at her, not angry for a second, just confused, like he genuinely had not realized exhaustion could reach a limit. "I work every day," Linda continued. "Every day, Ray. I leave before sunrise. I come home and pray you're in a decent mood. Annie walks on eggshells around you. We both do." Her voice shook now from tiredness, more than fear. "And tonight you put my daughter outside." Ray looked away first. Richard saw it happen. People looked away when truth finally became too expensive to hold. "Linda," Ray muttered, "you know I get angry. You get cruel. That ain't the same thing." "It becomes the same thing after enough years." The cold moved through the porch again. Somewhere down near the lake, Wind stirred through the trees. Ray rubbed one hand over his face. So what now? You staying here with him? The ugliness returned quickly, easier than remorse. Richard answered before Linda could. They're staying here tonight. Ray laughed again, but weaker this time. You just letting strangers move in now? It's one night. That's how trouble starts. Richard looked at him calmly. No. Trouble started long before tonight. For a second, Ray looked like he might shout again. Instead, he looked suddenly tired. Not sympathetic tired. Mean people got tired too. He glanced toward Annie. You really not coming home? Annie held the blanket tighter around herself. Not tonight. Ray stared at her for another moment, then looked back at Linda. You choosing her over me again? Linda answered so quietly, Richard almost missed it. No, Ray. I'm finally choosing peace. Ray swallowed hard enough for everyone to see it. Then anger rushed back in to cover whatever had almost appeared underneath. Fine, he snapped. Stay here. See how long rich folks play hero. He turned away from the porch, muttering under his breath as he headed down the driveway. Halfway to the gate, he shouted one last time without looking back. You always think everybody else is the problem. Then he disappeared into the dark. The house stayed silent after he left. Linda leaned suddenly against the wall beside the door like her knees had weakened all at once. Richard closed the door and locked it quietly. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Annie asked softly, Mama, you okay? Linda laughed once under her breath. I don't even know anymore. Richard looked at both of them standing in his foyer beneath the warm lights, wrapped in blankets and exhaustion. Then he said something neither woman expected. You know what the strange thing is? Linda looked up tiredly. What? This house has been quiet for years. Richard glanced toward the kitchen. Tonight's the first time it sounded alive. Linda stood quietly near the front door after Ray disappeared beyond the gate. Her arms remained folded tightly across her chest. Not from cold anymore, but from habit. Like she had spent years holding herself together physically. So nothing inside would fall apart. Annie moved closer. Mama? Linda blinked and looked at her daughter as if she had forgotten other people were still in the room. I'm okay, she said automatically. Annie gave her a tired look. No, you're not. For some reason, that nearly made Linda cry harder than Ray's yelling had. Richard noticed it and stepped back toward the kitchen deliberately, giving her room to breathe without making it obvious. Coffee's still warm enough to pretend it's fresh, he said. That's the best I can offer at 2 in the morning. Linda laughed weakly through her nose. Honestly, at the care center we drink coffee that tastes like burnt pennies. Yours is probably fine. That's an upsetting description. It's accurate. The tension loosened slightly after that. They returned to the kitchen together, slower this time. Annie stayed close beside her mother while Richard poured fresh coffee into another mug. Linda wrapped both hands around it immediately, absorbing the warmth before even taking a sip. You know, Richard said, leaning lightly against the counter. Most people in this neighborhood panic when someone knocks after 9 o'clock. Linda glanced toward the front windows. Most people in this neighborhood probably never had to work double shifts. That too. Annie sat back down at the kitchen island, blanket still around her shoulders. Her eyes looked heavy now. The fear had drained enough to leave exhaustion behind. Linda noticed immediately. Mothers notice those things before anyone else. You're tired, baby. Annie shrugged. Little bit. A little bit? Linda shook her head softly. You look ready to pass out sitting up. I'm okay. Richard pointed toward the hallway with his coffee mug. That sentence has officially been overused tonight. Annie smiled despite herself. Linda looked around the kitchen again, quieter this time. I still can't believe this place. It's just a house. No, she said gently. It's not. Her eyes moved over the polished counters, the soft lights, the clean quiet. Places like this feel different when you didn't grow up around them. Richard understood exactly what she meant. When he was younger, before the company succeeded, before the lake house and the boardrooms and magazine interviews, he had once visited the home of a wealthy investor with his father. He still remembered how carefully his father held his coffee cup that day, terrified of damaging something he could never afford to replace. Money changed posture before it changed anything else. You know what the funny part is? Richard said. I spent 30 years trying to afford a house this size. He looked around the kitchen. Then one day, everybody I loved stopped being inside it. The room grew still. Linda lowered her mug slowly. Your wife passed too? Richard nodded once. How long? 7 years. Linda's expression softened with recognition only another tired adult could give. That kind of loneliness settles into the walls after a while. Richard looked at her carefully then. Most people spoke around grief. Linda spoke to it directly. You understand that pretty well, he said. Linda stared into her coffee. Hospice wing at the care center teaches you things. She smiled faintly without humor. People spend their whole lives chasing money, pride, arguments. Then at the end, most of them just want somebody to sit beside the bed. Nobody spoke for a moment after that. Then Annie asked quietly, "Did your daughter die too?" The question hung gently in the room. Richard looked toward the dark hallway leading deeper into the house. Yes. Annie immediately looked guilty. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked. It's all right. How old was she? Nina Dan. Linda closed her eyes briefly. Annie swallowed. That's close to my age. Richard nodded. What happened? She asked carefully. For a moment it seemed like he might not answer. Then he walked toward the kitchen window and folded his arms loosely. Car accident, he said. Drunk driver crossed the median. The room fell silent again. Annie's fingers tightened around the blanket. Linda whispered, I'm sorry. Richard gave a small nod. The strange thing about grief is people expect it to arrive loudly. He looked out toward the dark lake. Most days it's quieter than that. It just sits beside you while you make coffee. Linda understood that sentence immediately. He could tell by her face. Annie looked at him differently now. Not like a rich stranger. More like someone carrying damage she recognized. You still keep her room the same, Annie said softly. Yes. Why? Richard smiled faintly to himself. Because fathers are ridiculous sometimes. That earned a quiet laugh from both women. The clock in the hallway chimed 2:30. Linda rubbed her eyes. Lord, Richard pointed upstairs. Both of you need sleep before sunrise sneaks up on us. Linda hesitated again. Mr. Whitmore, Richard is fine. I can't call you Richard. Why not? You own half the buildings downtown. That sounds like a reason, not an explanation. Annie snorted softly into the blanket. Linda shook her head tiredly. People where I'm from don't call men like you Richard. Richard leaned one elbow on the counter. People where I'm from didn't either. Then I got old and stopped caring. That finally made Linda laugh properly. Short, tired, real. The sound lingered in the kitchen afterward. Richard noticed Annie smiling at her mother quietly, like hearing that laugh mattered more than anything else in the room. And suddenly he understood something important. The girl was not strongest when she defended herself. She was strongest when she protected her mother from despair. Linda stood slowly from the chair. We really should try sleeping. Yes, Richard agreed. Preferably before Martha arrives in the morning and assumes I've opened a homeless shelter without warning her. Annie looked startled. Somebody else is coming? My housekeeper. Richard checked the clock. Usually around 7. Annie immediately looked nervous again. She's gonna be upset. Oh, absolutely, Richard said calmly, but mostly because I reheated soup without supervision. Even Linda laughed at that. The three of them walked slowly toward the staircase together. At the bottom step, Annie paused and glanced toward the front door. You think Ray'll come back? Richard followed her gaze. Then he answered honestly, yes. Neither woman looked surprised. Neither woman looked surprised. That was the part Richard disliked most. Not fear. Not exhaustion. Recognition. People should never become unsurprised by trouble. He waited until Linda and Annie disappeared upstairs before finally turning off the kitchen lights. The house settled slowly around him again. Floorboards creaking softly as the heater pushed warm air through the vents. At nearly 3 in the morning, Richard should have been exhausted. Instead, he stood alone in the foyer staring at the front door where Ray had pounded hard enough to shake the glass. Then he walked to the security panel near the hallway and checked the outside cameras. The driveway sat empty now, beneath pale security lights. Frost had started gathering lightly near the stone edges by the lake path. No movement. No shadows. Still, Richard locked the lower bolt too. Old instincts. When you spent decades building companies, you learned quickly that trouble rarely announced itself only once. Upstairs, Annie lay awake staring at the unfamiliar ceiling. The room smelled faintly like cedar wood and old books. The blankets were too soft. The mattress too comfortable. Everything about the room felt borrowed from another life. She turned carefully onto her side. Near the bookshelf sat framed photographs she had noticed earlier but been too nervous to study. A girl with curly dark hair grinned beside a birthday cake in one picture. In another, she stood holding car keys proudly while Richard pretended to look terrified. Ninettein, the same age almost. Annie pulled the blanket closer under her chin. She wondered what kind of father kept a room untouched for 7 years. Then she wondered what kind of pain made him do it. A soft knock startled her. "You awake?" Linda whispered through the door. "Yeah." Her mother stepped inside wearing one of the spare sweaters Richard had left folded outside the guest room. It hung loose around her shoulders. Annie could immediately tell Linda felt awkward wearing something expensive. "Mama, you okay?" Linda sat carefully at the edge of the bed. "Couldn't sleep." "Me neither." For a while they sat quietly. Then Linda looked around the room again. "This place feels unreal." Annie nodded. "You know what's sad?" Linda said softly. "I spent half my life thinking rich people were happier." Annie looked at the family photo beside the lamp. "Maybe they just suffer quieter." Linda followed her gaze toward the picture frame. "Mr. Whitmore loved his family," she said. "You can tell. That kind of grief changes a person." Annie studied her mother's tired face carefully. "Mama, why'd you stay with Ray?" Linda closed her eyes briefly. "Not offended. Just tired. When your grandma died," she began quietly, "everything hit at once. Rent went up. My car broke down. Hospital bills from grandma's treatments kept showing up months later." She rubbed her hands together slowly. "Ray helped in the beginning. He yells all the time. He didn't used to. He still does now." Linda nodded faintly. "I know. Then why stay?" Her mother looked down at her own hands for so long Annie thought she might not answer. Finally she said, "Because leaving costs money too. The honesty of it hurt more than excuses would have." Linda continued quietly. "You know how many women at the care center stayed married to cruel men because they couldn't afford not to? One lady told me once, 'Loneliness is expensive.' I didn't understand what she meant back then." Annie frowned slightly. "Do you now?" Linda gave a tired smile. "Yeah." The room fell quiet again. Then Annie asked the question she had been holding all night. "Are we really going back there tomorrow?" Linda didn't answer immediately. Downstairs, a floorboard creaked faintly somewhere in the big quiet house. "I don't know," she admitted. Annie looked stunned, not because of the answer, because her mother had finally said it out loud. Linda looked at her daughter carefully then. "You've been unhappy a long time, haven't you?" Annie laughed softly through her nose. "Mama, you just figuring that out?" Instead of smiling, Linda's eyes filled with guilt. "I kept telling myself things would calm down. I know. I thought if I worked harder." "I know." Linda pressed her lips together tightly. "I'm sorry, Annie." The apology came from somewhere deep this time. Not automatic, not defensive. Annie moved closer and leaned her head gently against her mother's shoulder. For years, Linda had spent her life protecting Annie from poverty. Tonight, Annie realized her mother had also been trying to protect herself from hopelessness. Downstairs, Richard sat alone in the study with a file open in front of him he had not read for 20 minutes. His late wife used to accuse him of thinking loudly. Tonight, the entire house felt full of it. Finally, he stood, loosened his tie completely, and headed toward the kitchen for another cup of coffee he did not need. Halfway there, he noticed movement near the staircase. Annie. She stood barefoot at the bottom step, wrapped in the blanket again. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Nobody sleeps in this house anymore." Annie smiled faintly. "Guess not. You hungry again?" "No." "Good. I'm running out of eggs." That earned a small laugh. Richard poured coffee into his mug while Annie lingered near the kitchen entrance. "You okay?" he asked without looking up. She hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Depends how expensive the question is." "Why'd you help us?" Richard leaned against the counter quietly. Most people ask that question much sooner. Finally, he answered honestly. "Because I know what it looks like when somebody's trying too hard to survive." Annie absorbed that silently. Richard studied her for a second. "And because my daughter would have yelled at me from heaven if I left you outside." That caught Annie off guard enough to make her laugh properly. "There she is again," Richard said. "What?" "The teenager." Annie rolled her eyes slightly. "I'm 18, not 12. 18-year-olds are just 12-year-olds with stronger opinions." She shook her head, smiling faintly. Then her expression faded again. "You think Ray's dangerous?" Richard answered immediately. "Yes. Annie looked down. But, he continued calmly, I also think men like that count on people believing they have all the power. She frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means fear becomes furniture after enough years. People stop noticing it's there. Richard sipped his coffee, until one day somebody opens the curtains and realizes how dark the room actually was. Annie stood quietly absorbing that. Then, very softly, she asked, what if Mama can't leave him? Richard looked toward the upstairs hallway where Linda slept, then back at Annie. Sometimes, he said, people need to see they have somewhere safe to stand before they're willing to walk away. Annie stood quietly beside the kitchen entrance after Richard spoke. What if Mama can't leave him? Richard looked toward the upstairs hallway where Linda slept, then back at Annie. Sometimes, he said, people need to see they have somewhere safe to stand before they're willing to walk away. The words stayed with Annie long after she finally went back upstairs. She slept eventually, though lightly, waking every hour at small sounds the house made settling into dawn. Each time she opened her eyes, she needed a second to remember where she was. The soft blankets, the quiet hallway, the room that belonged to a dead girl whose father still couldn't pack her things away. At 6:30, the smell of coffee drifted upstairs. Annie sat up slowly. For one confused second, she thought she had overslept for work. Then memory returned all at once. Ray, the porch. Richard Whitmore. She rubbed her face hard and climbed out of bed. The house was still mostly quiet when she stepped into the hallway. Linda's guest room door remained shut. Annie moved carefully downstairs, almost embarrassed to exist too loudly in someone else's home. Halfway down the staircase, she heard voices from the kitchen. A woman's voice, sharp, fast, unimpressed. Richard Whitmore. I leave you alone for one evening, and suddenly there are strangers sleeping upstairs? Annie froze. Richard sounded calmer. Good morning to you too, Martha. You used my good soup. I reheated soup. You reheated it badly. I can smell it from here. Annie hesitated near the staircase. Then Martha Reed appeared from the kitchen carrying grocery bags in both hands. She was a black woman in her 60s with silver-gray curls tucked beneath a knit cap and the posture of someone who had spent 40 years refusing nonsense from everybody equally. She spotted Annie instantly. The older woman stopped. Annie immediately straightened. I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to. Oh, honey. If you apologize in this house one more time, I'm charging people $1 for it. That startled Annie enough that she blinked. Martha shifted the grocery bags onto the counter. So you're the porch girl? Richard muttered into his coffee. That sounds worse than it should. Martha ignored him. Her eyes stayed on Annie, sharp but not unkind. You eaten breakfast? Annie glanced toward Richard automatically before answering. Martha caught it immediately. No, she said firmly. We are not doing that in here. Annie looked confused. Doing what? Asking permission with your eyes before speaking. Martha waved one hand dismissively. That's fear behavior. Don't bring that mess into my kitchen. Richard hid a smile behind his coffee mug. Martha pointed toward a chair. Sit down. Annie obeyed automatically. There it is again, Martha muttered. Straight obedience. Child's been surviving angry people too long. Annie looked down at the table. Martha softened slightly then. What's your name, baby? Annie. Well, Annie, I've worked in this house 22 years, and I can promise you one thing. She opened the refrigerator while speaking. Richard looks intimidating, but half the time he forgets where he left his own reading glasses. Richard sighed. Good morning, Martha. You burned eggs at 2 in the morning. I made edible eggs. You made legal eggs. Different thing. Despite herself, Annie laughed. Martha glanced back immediately. There she is. Pretty smile, too. Shame people made you hide it. Annie looked down again, embarrassed by kindness more than criticism. Martha moved around the kitchen with practiced ownership, pulling out bacon, bread, butter. Unlike Richard, she treated the giant house like something alive instead of something expensive. You staying long? Martha asked casually. Annie hesitated. I don't know. Meaning, yes, Martha translated calmly. Richard leaned against the counter. Nothing's decided yet. Martha snorted softly. Annie looked between them carefully. You two argue like family. We do, Martha replied. Richard nodded once. She's been threatening to quit for 19 years, because you refused to throw away expired salad dressing. It expired 3 days earlier. It's separated in the bottle, Richard. The front staircase creaked softly behind them. Linda appeared wearing the same oversized sweater from the night before, her hair slightly flattened on one side from sleep. For a moment she looked disoriented, seeing another person in the kitchen. Then embarrassment arrived. "Oh Lord," she murmured. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." Martha immediately pointed a butter knife toward her. "No apologizing before breakfast. House rule." Linda blinked. Richard looked innocent. "Sounds reasonable to me." Martha walked over and held out her hand. "Martha Reed. Linda Brooks." Linda shook it gently. Martha studied her face carefully in the way older women often studied each other, taking inventory of exhaustion without making it humiliating. "You look tired." Linda laughed softly. "I work at Street Ann's Care Center. Tired's part of the uniform." "Oh, baby. I know those shifts." Martha shook her head knowingly. "My sister did hospice care 30 years. Good people burn themselves down helping strangers." Something passed quietly between the two women then. Recognition. Martha motioned toward the table. "Sit. Both of you." Linda immediately protested. "We really don't want to impose." "Too late," Martha replied. "You already slept upstairs. We passed politeness now." Even Richard laughed at that. Martha started cooking while talking at the same time. The kitchen slowly filled with the smell of bacon and butter and coffee, stronger than Richard's weak attempt from earlier. For the first time since arriving, Annie found herself relaxing without noticing it. Then Martha asked casually, "So where's the fool husband?" The room quieted. Linda lowered her eyes slightly. "At home, probably." "Drunk?" Linda hesitated. Martha nodded before she even answered. I know that hesitation too." Richard looked toward Martha carefully but said nothing. Martha kept cooking. "You know what my mother used to say?" She flipped bacon with one hand. "Women can survive poor men, proud men, even broken men. But cruel men eat the light out of a house." Nobody spoke for a second after that. Then Annie whispered quietly, "That sounds like Ray." Martha looked at her gently. "Baby, if it sounds familiar that fast, you already know the truth." Nobody spoke for a second after that. Then Annie whispered quietly, "That sounds like Ray." Martha looked at her gently. "Baby, if it sounds familiar that fast, you already know the truth." The kitchen fell quiet except for bacon crackling in the pan. Linda stared down into her coffee cup as though something inside it required all her concentration. Richard watched her carefully. He had seen that look before in boardrooms and hospitals and funeral homes. It was the face people made when denial started losing ground. Martha carried plates to the table without ceremony. "Eat before everything gets cold." Nobody argued. The breakfast itself felt strangely normal. Toast passed from hand to hand. Coffee refilled. Bacon disappeared quickly, because Annie was 18, and hungry enough to finally stop pretending otherwise. Martha noticed. "There you go," she said approvingly. "Young people supposed to eat like they're preparing for winter." Annie smiled with a mouth half full of toast. "Mama says the same thing. Your mama's smart." Linda shook her head softly. "No, I'm just Southern. Same thing sometimes." Even Richard laughed quietly at that. For nearly 20 minutes, the house felt ordinary. Then Linda's phone vibrated against the kitchen table. Every muscle in Annie's shoulders tightened instantly. Linda stared at the screen without touching it. Richard saw the caller ID reflected faintly in her glasses before she turned the phone over. "Ray." The buzzing stopped, then started again immediately. Martha snorted softly from the stove. "Persistent fool." Linda swallowed. "I should answer." "No, you shouldn't," Annie said immediately. "He'll keep calling." "That doesn't mean you answer." Linda looked torn. Richard spoke calmly. "What happens if you ignore him for one morning?" Linda gave a tired laugh under her breath. "Usually, more yelling later. Louder is louder." The phone buzzed again. This time Martha reached over, picked it up, and switched it face down without asking. "There," she said. "Now he can scream into voicemail like the rest of America." Linda looked startled. Then, unexpectedly, Annie laughed. A real laugh this time. Martha pointed a fork toward her. "That sound right there? That's your actual personality trying to come back." Annie looked embarrassed again. "Sorry." "Dollar in the jar," Martha replied automatically. Richard leaned back in his chair watching them quietly. Something about the sight unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. Not because they looked out of place, because they didn't. That realization landed strangely inside him. Linda finally looked toward Richard. Mr. Whit, Richard, we need to go back eventually. Annie's expression dropped immediately. Richard folded his hands loosely on the table. Do you? Linda hesitated. Our clothes are there. Bills. Annie's school things. Those are belongings, Martha corrected calmly. Not reasons. Linda stared down again. Martha softened her tone slightly. Baby, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just old enough to know women spend too much time confusing survival with obligation. Richard watched Linda absorb that silently. Then Annie spoke carefully. Mama, when was the last time you felt relaxed at home? Linda opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The silence answered for her. Martha sat down finally with her own coffee. You know what cruel men count on? Nobody answered. They count on exhaustion. They know tired people stop imagining better lives after a while. Linda rubbed her forehead slowly. It's not that simple. No, Martha agreed. It's usually sadder. The phone buzzed again against the table. This time Richard reached over and muted it entirely. Linda looked at him nervously. He's gonna get angry. He already is. That's different. Richard shook his head slightly. No, it just feels more familiar. Annie looked between them quietly. Then Linda's eyes suddenly widened toward the kitchen window. A pickup truck had pulled slowly into the driveway. Everybody turned. Ray climbed out before the engine fully stopped. Lord have mercy, Martha muttered. Ray slammed the truck door hard enough to echo across the yard. Even from inside, they could tell he was still angry. Maybe not drunk anymore, but angry in that colder morning way that often replaced alcohol after sunrise. Annie stood automatically. Richard remained seated. Ray started toward the front door with determined strides until he noticed movement through the kitchen windows. Then his eyes locked directly onto Annie. Linda whispered, "Oh no." The front doorbell rang once. Then again, longer this time. Nobody moved immediately. Ray knocked hard enough to shake the glass panels beside the door. Linda. Martha stood calmly and picked up her coffee. Not before breakfast digests. Linda looked panicked now. He'll make a scene. Richard stood slowly from the table. This neighborhood survives on scenes. It'll be all right. Richard, you don't have to speak to him if you don't want to. Ray pounded again. Linda. Annie looked pale. Richard noticed and lowered his voice. Stay here. He walked toward the foyer while Martha casually followed, carrying her coffee mug like she was headed toward television entertainment. You are absolutely not coming with me, Richard muttered. I raised 3 boys in Detroit, Martha replied. You think I'm scared of one loud idiot in work boots? Ray hit the door again just as Richard unlocked it. The moment the door opened, Ray started talking. You can't keep my family in here like prisoners. Then he noticed Martha standing behind Richard. Ray blinked. Martha looked him up and down slowly. Well, you certainly look disappointing in daylight. Richard coughed into his fist to hide a laugh. Ray frowned deeply. Who the hell is she? The person most unimpressed by you this morning, Martha answered before Richard could speak. Ray ignored her and looked past Richard toward the kitchen. Linda. Linda stepped halfway into view reluctantly. Ray's voice changed immediately, softer, controlled. There you are. Martha rolled her eyes so hard Annie could practically hear it from the kitchen doorway. Ray spread his hands. Baby, can we stop all this? Linda looked exhausted already. Stop what? This drama. Annie stiffened. Richard's face cooled instantly. But Martha spoke first. A child sleeping on somebody's porch in winter ain't drama, she said sharply. That's failure. Ray stared at her. This ain't your business. Everything ugly becomes my business once it walks into somebody else's peace acting loud. For the first time since arriving, Ray seemed unsure of himself. Not afraid, just unprepared. Men like him usually expected silence from women once they raised their voices. Martha had clearly missed that lesson entirely. Men like him usually expected silence from women once they raised their voices. Martha had clearly missed that lesson entirely. Ray shifted uncomfortably beneath her stare. Look, I came to get my family. Martha took another sip of coffee. Funny way to talk about people you threw outside. Ray's jaw tightened. I already said things got heated. Heated? Martha repeated. Boy, you locked a teenage girl out in the cold. She's 18, and you're old enough to know better. Richard stayed quiet beside the door, watching carefully. Ray's anger kept trying to rise, but Martha's presence disrupted the rhythm of it. Bullies depended on intimidation landing cleanly. Martha treated him like an annoying customer at a grocery store. Ray looked past them again toward Linda. "Baby, can we talk privately?" Linda hesitated. Annie appeared near the kitchen entrance immediately. "Mama, it's okay," Linda said softly, though nobody believed it. Richard opened the door wider but remained standing there. "5 minutes," he said calmly. "On the porch." Ray scoffed. "You supervising conversations now?" "In my house?" "Yes," Martha muttered into her mug. "And thank God for that." Linda stepped carefully onto the porch, pulling the oversized sweater tighter around herself against the morning cold. Ray followed her outside. Richard remained just inside the doorway while Martha leaned casually against the wall nearby like she had nowhere else in the world to be. Annie stood frozen near the hallway. "You can still hear them from there," Martha said gently. Annie looked embarrassed. "I wasn't trying to listen. Baby, concern ain't the same thing as spying." Outside, Ray lowered his voice enough that they could not hear every word clearly anymore. But his body language said plenty. Fast hand gestures, frustration, the defensive posture of a man who believed apology meant losing. Linda mostly listened, then finally she spoke. Even through the glass, Richard could tell something had changed. She was no longer shrinking while talking. Ray noticed too. His shoulders stiffened immediately. He stepped closer. Richard straightened slightly near the door. Martha spoke quietly without looking at him. "You got good instincts. I buried a daughter." Richard replied softly. "My instincts don't sleep anymore." Martha looked at him then. Not pity, recognition. Outside, Ray raised his voice again. "We had problems before this, Linda. And whose fault is that?" Linda snapped back. The sharpness in her voice startled Annie enough that she stepped closer to the door. Ray pointed angrily toward the house. "You got these rich people filling your head now." "No," Linda shot back. "I got one good night of sleep filling my head." Silence followed. Even Martha smiled slightly at that one. Ray stared at Linda, like he no longer recognized the conversation. "You really gonna leave me?" he asked. The question sounded smaller than everything else he had shouted since arriving. Linda looked tired more than angry now. "I've been leaving you little by little for years," she admitted quietly. "I just didn't say it out loud yet." Ray laughed bitterly and rubbed both hands over his face. "So what now? You move into this mansion? You think people like him actually care about people like us?" Inside the house, Annie lowered her eyes immediately. Richard noticed. That sentence had landed somewhere familiar. Linda looked back toward the doorway then, toward Annie, toward the warm kitchen behind her. Then she turned back to Ray. "You know what the difference is?" she asked softly. Ray frowned. Everybody inside that house spoke to Annie like she mattered. The words hit harder than yelling ever had. Ray opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Linda continued, voice shaking now from years of exhaustion finally reaching daylight. "Do you know the first thing Richard Whitmore asked my daughter last night? He asked if she was cold." Her eyes filled suddenly. "You know what you asked? Why dinner wasn't ready." Ray looked away. Martha whispered quietly, "There it is." Richard stayed silent. Linda stepped back from Ray slightly. "I'm tired of surviving somebody else's anger." Ray looked toward the driveway, jaw tight. "So that's it?" Linda nodded once. "For now, Annie and I aren't coming back." Annie covered her mouth with one hand. Inside the foyer, Richard felt the entire house go still around that sentence. Ray stared at Linda for several long seconds. Then the humiliation finally arrived. Not guilt, humiliation. His face hardened again immediately to cover it. "You think this ends well?" he muttered. Linda looked exhausted. "No, Ray. I think it ends honestly." Ray laughed sharply under his breath. "You always did think struggle made you noble. And you always thought hurting people made you strong." That one landed clean. Ray looked stunned for half a second. Then anger returned fully. "Fine," he snapped. "Take your little daughter and go play house with millionaires." Richard finally spoke again. Calm. Flat. "You should leave now." Ray pointed toward him. "You stay out of this." Richard met his eyes evenly. That option ended when she asked to sleep on my porch. For a moment it looked like Ray might say something uglier. Instead, he looked toward Annie standing inside the foyer. "You really hate me that much?" he asked her. The question caught her off guard. Annie swallowed. "I don't hate you. Could have fooled me. She stared at him quietly for a long moment before answering. I just got tired of being scared all the time. The honesty of it emptied the porch. Ray's face changed slightly. Not enough to fix anything, but enough to wound him. Nobody moved. Then Martha broke the silence. Well, she announced calmly, this conversation has officially overstayed breakfast. Richard almost smiled. Ray shook his head once, muttering under his breath. Then he turned and walked down the porch steps slower than before. Not defeated, just alone. At the driveway, he stopped briefly without turning around. You know what your problem is, Linda? He said quietly. You always believe kindness means safety. Linda's answer came immediately. No, I just finally learned fear isn't love. Ray stood there one more second. Then he climbed into the truck and drove away. Nobody inside the house moved until the sound of the engine disappeared completely down the road. Then Annie suddenly started crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the exhausted tears of someone whose body finally realized it had survived the night. Nobody inside the house moved until the sound of the engine disappeared completely down the road. Then Annie suddenly started crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the exhausted tears of someone whose body finally realized it had survived the night. Linda reached her first. Oh, baby. Annie shook her head immediately, embarrassed by the tears even while they kept coming. I'm sorry. Martha groaned softly from behind them. That apology habit is becoming a medical condition. Richard quietly closed the front door while Linda wrapped both arms around her daughter. I didn't know he was going to come here again, Annie whispered. I thought maybe if we stayed quiet long enough. I know, Linda said softly against her hair. I know. Annie cried harder after that. Not because her mother fixed anything, because she finally stopped pretending things were fine. Martha walked back toward the kitchen, muttering under her breath about grown men built emotionally like broken lawnmowers. Richard followed her slowly, giving Linda and Annie privacy in the foyer. By the time the two women returned to the kitchen several minutes later, Annie's eyes were red and Linda looked emotionally wrung dry. Martha slid a fresh plate of toast toward them both without comment. Eat, she said simply. Crying burns energy. That startled a tired laugh out of Annie. See? Martha pointed at her. Still alive. Richard sat quietly at the far end of the table watching the morning light settle through the windows. The lake beyond the backyard looked silver under the cold Georgia sky. Linda finally broke the silence. I meant what I said out there. Nobody interrupted her. We're not going back. Annie looked at her mother carefully, like she was afraid the sentence might disappear if spoken too loudly. Martha nodded once, as if confirming something she already knew. Richard folded his hands together loosely. All right. Linda blinked. That's it? What were you expecting? I don't know. Advice, maybe. Richard glanced toward the front windows. You've spent years surviving somebody else's anger. I doubt you need another person telling you how your own life feels. Linda sat very still after that. Then she laughed softly through her nose. You know what's strange? Last night I felt embarrassed being here. She looked around the kitchen slowly. Now I feel embarrassed that peace feels unfamiliar. Nobody rushed to answer. Some truths deserved silence around them first. Annie rubbed both hands around her coffee mug. What do we do now? Linda looked exhausted again immediately. I don't know. Do you have family nearby? Richard asked. Linda shook her head. Most are back in Alabama. My sister moved to Texas years ago. And the apartment lease? It's in my name. Linda gave a humorless little smile. Ray never kept a job long enough to qualify for much. Martha sat down across from her. Then that's one less chain already. Linda looked uncertain. I still can't afford that place alone. You were already affording it alone, Annie said quietly. That sentence settled heavily over the table. Linda stared at her daughter for a moment, then slowly nodded. Richard spoke carefully. What about your schooling, Annie? Annie looked surprised by the question. What about it? You planning to continue? If I can. That sounded doubtful. She shrugged lightly. Nursing school costs money. Mama already works too much. Linda immediately shook her head. No, don't start giving things up because of me. I'm being realistic. You're being 18 and already talking like your life's over. Annie looked down again. Richard noticed she did that whenever hope entered the conversation. Like optimism itself made her nervous. Martha noticed too. How are your grades? Martha asked. Annie blinked. Good. How good? I got mostly A's. Richard raised an eyebrow. Mostly? 1B in anatomy. That class is awful, Linda admitted instantly. I almost cried taking it myself. Martha looked unimpressed. So the child's smart. Annie flushed slightly. I study hard. Richard leaned back in his chair, quietly considering something. Then he asked, You still working at the barbecue place? 3 nights a week. How much do they pay you? Not enough, Martha answered before Annie could. That earned another small laugh around the table. The atmosphere shifted after that. Not lighter exactly, but steadier. Like everybody in the room had finally stopped pretending the truth needed decorating. Linda suddenly looked toward Richard nervously. We can't stay here long. You've mentioned that. I mean it. I heard you the first 3 times, too. I don't want charity. Richard looked mildly offended. Miss Brooks, if I wanted to offer charity, I'd donate to another museum gala and listen to rich people congratulate themselves over dry chicken. Martha snorted into her coffee. Richard continued calmly. What I'm offering is time. There's a difference. Linda stared at him carefully. Stay a few days, he said. Sleep. Think clearly. Figure out what you want before panic makes the decision for you. Annie looked immediately toward her mother. Linda still hesitated. You don't even know us, she said quietly. Richard looked around the kitchen, then toward Annie, then back at Linda. I know enough. The answer sat in the room gently. Martha stood and gathered empty plates. And frankly, this house has needed people in it for years. Richard sighed softly. You're all becoming very comfortable speaking on my emotional state, because yours been wandering around unsupervised too long. Annie laughed into her coffee again. Richard pointed toward her. You encourage her, and suddenly everybody's bold. Good, Martha replied. Fear makes people quiet. Quiet keeps bad situations alive. That sentence hit Linda visibly. She stared at the table for several long seconds before speaking again. I don't even know where to begin. Richard answered simply. Begin with rest. Martha nodded firmly. Then paperwork. Then lawyers if necessary. Then a better apartment with decent locks. Linda looked overwhelmed just hearing it all out loud. Annie reached over slowly and took her mother's hand. We'll figure it out, she said softly. Linda looked at her daughter and something shifted in her face then. Not fear. Not exhaustion. Something closer to relief finally allowing itself into the room. Outside, morning sunlight spread slowly across the lake behind the house while inside the kitchen, 4 people sat around a table that had stopped feeling temporary. Outside, morning sunlight spread slowly across the lake behind the house, while inside the kitchen, 4 people sat around a table that had stopped feeling temporary. For the first time in years, Richard realized breakfast had lasted longer than 10 minutes in his home. Usually mornings were silent. Coffee alone. News playing low in another room nobody listened to. Martha complaining while he pretended not to hear her. Now the kitchen carried conversation. Life. It unsettled him more than he expected. Martha gathered dishes toward the sink while Linda insisted on helping despite repeated objections. You are a guest, Martha reminded her. And you cooked. I cook every morning. And I still have hands. Martha finally gave up arguing. Fine. But if you load my dishwasher wrong, we become enemies. That earned another laugh from Annie. Richard noticed something important then. The girl laughed easier today. Still cautious. Still watchful. But easier. He stood near the kitchen window reviewing emails on his phone when Annie approached quietly beside him. You really work on weekends? I own the company, Richard said without looking up. That mostly means people bother me professionally 7 days a week. What kind of company is it? Commercial construction. Annie blinked. Like skyscrapers? Among other things. She looked out toward the lake again. Must be nice. Richard glanced at her. What part? Being successful. He studied her for a second. People usually imagine success removes pain. Mostly it just changes where the pain sits. Annie leaned lightly against the counter beside him. That sounds sad. It sounds 50. That drew a small smile from her. Richard slid his phone into his pocket. What about you? What would success look like? Annie answered quicker this time. A small apartment for Mama. Somewhere quiet. She shrugged lightly. Finishing school. Having enough money that groceries stopped being stressful. Richard nodded slowly. Not luxury. Not fame. Peace. That was the dream poverty created in people. Martha suddenly called from the sink. Richard, stop looking thoughtful. You'll frighten the child. I am literally standing here. Exactly. Linda smiled faintly while drying dishes. The exhaustion remained in her face, but something beneath it had loosened slightly. Not happiness yet. Just less fear pressing against every thought. Then her phone buzzed again on the counter. Everyone looked. This time the screen showed a different name. St. Anne's Care Center. Linda immediately picked it up. Hello? Her shoulders straightened gradually as she listened. Yes, I understand. Pause. No. Family emergency. Another pause. I know I left early. She closed her eyes briefly. Yes, ma'am. I can come tomorrow, Martha muttered quietly. Healthcare workers treated worse than farm equipment. Linda forced a tired smile into the phone. Thank you. I appreciate it. When the call ended, she lowered the phone slowly. You okay? Annie asked. Linda nodded faintly. Supervisor wanted to know if I planned on returning. That all? She also reminded me I've already missed too many shifts this year. Richard frowned slightly. How many? Linda looked embarrassed. 3. Martha stopped drying a plate. 3 shifts in 1 year? Linda shrugged helplessly. They're short-staffed. That woman should kiss your shoes for showing up at all. Richard quietly agreed. He had spent enough years running companies to recognize exploitation wrapped in professionalism. People praised hard-working employees right, until the moment those employees needed humanity in return. Annie looked toward her mother carefully. You don't have to go back tomorrow. Yes, I do. Mama, we need money. Richard spoke calmly before the conversation tightened further. You also need sleep. Linda rubbed her temple. Richard, I appreciate all this more than you know, but real life still exists outside this kitchen. Yes, he replied evenly. That's why exhausted people make dangerous decisions. Linda looked at him tiredly. What would you do in my position? Richard thought about it honestly, then answered honestly too. I'd stop making every decision based on fear. The room quieted after that, because everybody knew exactly what he meant. Linda stared down at the dish towel in her hands. You make it sound simple. No, Richard said softly. I make it sound necessary. For a while nobody spoke. Then Martha suddenly clapped her hands once. All right. Enough sadness before noon. Annie, come help me sort groceries. Annie blinked. You want help? I'm old, not decorative. That pulled Annie toward the counter while Martha unpacked grocery bags with military seriousness. You cook? Martha asked. A little. She means yes, Linda translated. Annie cooks most nights. Martha raised an eyebrow. At 18? Annie shrugged. Mama works late. Martha handed her a carton of eggs. Then today you making lunch. Annie looked alarmed. In this kitchen? Yes, in this kitchen. I don't know rich people food. Richard looked offended. I eat grilled cheese sandwiches over the sink sometimes. That explains a lot, Martha muttered. Annie laughed again. The sound carried through the room naturally now. Not forced. Not borrowed. Richard realized he had started waiting for it. An hour later, sunlight filled the kitchen completely while Annie stood at the stove nervously making grilled cheese sandwiches under Martha's supervision. Too much butter, Martha warned. Richard said he likes butter. Richard also thinks expired yogurt is still edible. It smelled fine, because your nose stopped functioning in 2009. Linda sat at the table watching them with quiet disbelief. Richard noticed. What? He asked. She smiled faintly. I forgot mornings could feel normal. The sentence landed gently. Annie turned from the stove holding a spatula. Mama, you remember when Grandma used to dance while cooking? Linda laughed softly. Offbeat every single time. She thought she could sing. She absolutely could not. For several minutes the conversation drifted toward old memories. Annie's grandmother burning cornbread twice every Thanksgiving. Cheap radio music playing in small apartments. Childhood stories. Tiny things. Richard listened more than he spoke, and somewhere during all of it, he realized the house no longer sounded haunted. Then the doorbell rang. Everyone looked up, not violently this time, just once, but Annie still froze automatically. Richard noticed that too. I'll get it, he said calmly. He walked toward the foyer while the others stayed silent behind him. When he opened the front door, a delivery driver stood holding several large boxes. Morning, Mr. Whitmore. Furniture delivery. Richard frowned. Furniture. The driver checked his clipboard. Dining set and bedroom items for Linda Brooks. Richard blinked once. Behind him, Martha started laughing before anybody else understood what was happening. Then Linda covered her mouth with both hands, and Annie whispered, completely stunned, "Mama, you bought something?" Behind him, Martha started laughing before anybody else understood what was happening. Then Linda covered her mouth with both hands, and Annie whispered, completely stunned, "Mama, you bought something?" Linda looked equally confused and emotional at the same time. "No, I didn't." The delivery driver checked the clipboard again. "Paid in full this morning. Delivery address updated about 30 minutes ago." Richard turned slowly toward the kitchen. Martha was already staring directly at him. "Oh no," she said immediately. "Don't you put that innocent rich man face on now." Richard frowned. "I genuinely have no idea what this is." Liar. Annie looked between them. "Wait, what's happening?" The driver shifted awkwardly beside the door, holding the clipboard. Should we bring the boxes inside or?" Martha waved him in before anyone answered. "Yes, baby, before somebody wealthy in this house develops selective memory permanently." Two movers carried in long cardboard boxes marked dining chairs, twin bed frame, kitchen table. Linda looked overwhelmed already. There has to be some mistake. Richard took the clipboard from the driver and scanned it once, then sighed quietly. At the bottom of the order was a familiar name, Martha Reed. Richard slowly looked up. Martha crossed her arms proudly. "That's right." Linda blinked hard. "You bought this?" "No." Martha pointed toward Richard. "His guilty credit card did." Richard stared at her. "Martha." "What?" "You were taking too long." Annie looked completely lost now. Martha leaned against the foyer table calmly. "Yesterday, after hearing that foolish man threw y'all out, I started thinking. Then this morning, Linda mentioned the apartment lease still being in her name." She shrugged. "So while you rich people were having emotional conversations over coffee, I ordered essentials." Linda looked like she might cry again. "Martha, we can't accept all this." "Why not?" "Because it's too much." Martha snorted softly. "Baby, it's a kitchen table and 2 beds. Not a yacht." Richard folded the clipboard slowly. "You used my account without asking. You would have said yes anyway." "That is not the point." "It absolutely is the point." Annie looked at Richard carefully. "You really didn't know?" "I knew she was capable of crimes," Richard muttered. "Not online shopping." Martha pointed toward him. "This from a man who bought a boat during a stress headache in 2014. I sold that boat because you hated boats." The movers carried another box past them while trying very hard not to react to the argument. Linda looked near panicked now. "Please. I appreciate this. I really do. But we can't let people spend money on us." Richard finally stepped in before Martha could answer sharply. "Linda." She looked at him. "You know what pride does to exhausted people?" Her eyes lowered slightly. "It convinces them accepting help is weakness while suffering alone is somehow honorable." The sentence quieted the entire foyer. Linda swallowed hard. Annie stood beside her mother looking at the boxes like they belonged to somebody else's life. Martha softened then. "Listen to me carefully, both of you." She pointed toward the furniture boxes. "Nobody's buying your dignity. Nobody's trying to own you. Sometimes people just help because they remember what hard years feel like." Annie looked at Richard. "You remember?" He answered honestly. "More than most people think." The movers finished carrying the final boxes inside. "Where you want these?" one asked. Nobody answered immediately, because suddenly the question felt larger than furniture. Where did they want these? Not just the boxes, their lives. Linda pressed one hand against her forehead briefly before laughing through tears. "Lord, I don't even know where we're gonna live yet." Martha looked unimpressed. "One problem at a time. First we stop surviving, then we organize." Richard finally handed the clipboard back to the driver. "Leave the boxes in the sunroom for now." After the door closed again, silence settled softly over the house. Annie walked slowly toward one of the unopened boxes and touched the cardboard carefully with her fingertips. "A real dining table," she whispered. Linda looked at her daughter. "Baby, we never had one." Annie laughed softly through disbelief. "Not an actual table." Richard felt something tighten painfully in his chest, not because of poverty itself, because of how quietly people learn to live without ordinary things. Martha clapped once. All right, nobody crying before lunch. I refuse. Linda wiped quickly beneath her eyes. I'm trying. I know. Annie looked toward Richard carefully. Why are you doing this? Richard leaned one hand into his pocket. I'm not. Yes, you are. No, he replied calmly. I'm just finally rich enough to stop pretending small acts of kindness require committee meetings. That answer stayed with Annie. She looked at him differently again after that. Not like a billionaire. Like a man trying to repair something invisible inside himself by refusing to let suffering walk past him twice. Linda sat slowly at the edge of the foyer bench. I spent so many years trying not to need anybody. Martha sat beside her immediately. And how'd that work out? Linda laughed despite herself. Exactly, Martha said. Richard glanced toward the lake through the tall windows. You know something I learned very late in life? Annie looked up. Most people don't drown because nobody throws a rope. He paused briefly. They drown because shame convinces them not to grab it. Nobody spoke after that, because everybody in the room understood it personally. A few minutes later, Annie helped Martha carry smaller boxes toward the sunroom while Linda stayed behind, speaking quietly with Richard near the foyer. You don't owe us this, Linda said softly. Richard nodded once. I know. I mean it. So do I. She looked toward the hallway where Annie's laughter drifted faintly from another room while Martha argued dramatically about where furniture should go someday. Then Linda looked back at Richard. You know what scares me most? She admitted quietly. What? That this feels safe. Richard understood immediately. People who lived around chaos too long often distrusted peace more than pain. He answered gently. Safe isn't the same thing as permanent. Linda frowned slightly. But sometimes, Richard continued, people need one peaceful room before they remember they deserve a peaceful life. Linda stared at him for several seconds. Then very quietly she asked, How long did it take you to learn that? Richard looked toward his daughter's old room upstairs. Too long, he thought. Far too long. But aloud he only said, long enough to regret it. Richard looked toward his daughter's old room upstairs. Too long, he thought. Far too long. But aloud he only said, long enough to regret it. The rest of the afternoon moved differently after that. Not dramatic. Not magical. Just quieter inside everyone's chest. Martha organized the delivered boxes with the authority of a woman who trusted her own judgment more than anybody else's. Annie followed her through the sunroom carrying smaller packages while Linda filled out paperwork at the kitchen table Richard had printed from his office upstairs: housing listings, legal aid contacts, temporary leave forms from the care center. Real things. Necessary things. For the first time since arriving, their future no longer sounded like panic. It sounded like decisions. By early evening, the winter sunlight had faded gold across the lake behind the house. Richard stood near the fireplace in the living room loosening his tie while Annie carefully unpacked one of the smaller boxes Martha had ordered. Inside sat a simple lamp. Nothing expensive. Nothing impressive. Annie touched the base carefully anyway. We really keeping all this? She asked softly. Martha looked up from the couch. Unless you're planning to eat dinner standing forever, yes. Annie smiled faintly. Linda entered from the kitchen carrying paperwork against her chest. She looked tired, but not defeated anymore. The difference mattered. I called the apartment office, she said quietly. Everyone looked at her. They said Ray can't legally remove us from the lease. Richard nodded once. Good. Linda sat slowly in the armchair near the fire. I also called my supervisor. She looked down at the papers. I'm taking a week off. Annie blinked in surprise. Mama, you never take time off. I know. You always say you can't afford it. Linda gave a small, tired smile. Turns out I couldn't afford not to. Martha pointed immediately. There it is. Growth. Even Richard laughed quietly at that. The fire cracked softly in the background while evening settled around the house. Annie sat cross-legged on the rug near the coffee table, sorting through unopened kitchen items, plates, towels, cheap silverware Martha insisted every home needed before decorations. Richard watched her quietly. A girl who had arrived asking for one corner of a porch now sat beside a fireplace planning where dishes might go someday. Life changed, strangely sometimes. Annie suddenly held up a small wooden picture frame from one of the boxes. Martha, why'd you buy this? Because homes need photographs. We don't really have family pictures. Linda looked over softly. Most of ours stayed in storage after Grandma passed. Annie lowered the frame again carefully. Richard crossed the room toward the bookshelf near the fireplace. After a moment, he pulled out an older framed photograph and carried it over. "My wife used to say empty frames make people feel temporary," he said. The picture showed a younger Richard standing beside his daughter at a county fair, both smiling badly into the camera while holding giant lemonade cups. Annie looked at it gently. "She had your eyes. That poor child suffered greatly for it." Linda smiled into her tea. Richard handed Annie the frame. "Until you get your own pictures back." Annie stared at him. "I can't take this." "You're borrowing it." "That's still important." Richard looked at the photograph for a moment before answering. "So are reminders that homes can hold good memories too." Annie accepted the frame slowly. The room fell quiet again after that, but comfortable now. Not empty, comfortable. Then Martha suddenly stood up. "All right. Enough emotional damage for one day. Richard, order dinner." "I can cook." "No," 3 voices answered at once. Richard looked offended. "That feels excessive." "You nearly poisoned scrambled eggs last night," Martha reminded him. "That was an isolated incident. That pan's still recovering." Annie laughed hard enough she had to lower her head. Richard pointed toward her. "You're getting bold." "She's getting safe," Martha corrected. The sentence settled warmly through the room. Safe. Not fixed. Not healed. But safe. An hour later, takeout containers covered the dining table while the television played softly in the background. Annie sat beside her mother eating Chinese food with the appetite of someone no longer afraid the evening would suddenly collapse. Linda looked around the room quietly during dinner. Then finally she spoke. "You know what scares me?" Martha sighed dramatically. "Lord, here we go." Linda smiled faintly. "No, not like that." She looked toward Richard. I forgot what kindness felt like without conditions attached." The room quieted. Richard set down his fork slowly. "Cruel people make generosity look suspicious." Linda nodded. "Yeah." Annie looked toward her mother carefully. "You still think we should leave tomorrow?" Linda glanced around the house. The firelight. The laughter from earlier still lingering softly in the room. Martha arguing with the television like the news anchors could hear her. Richard pretending not to smile at it. Peace. Simple peace. Then Linda looked back at Annie. "No," she said honestly. "I think we should stay long enough to remember who we are without fear in the room." Annie's eyes filled immediately. Richard looked away politely toward the fireplace. Martha pretended to focus very hard on soy sauce packets. Outside, night settled quietly across the lake while inside the house. Warmth gathered around people who had spent too long surviving cold places. Later that evening, after dishes were stacked and Martha finally went home threatening everyone to stay emotionally stable until morning, Annie wandered onto the back porch alone wrapped in a blanket. The lake reflected moonlight softly. Behind her, the warm house glowed through tall windows. Richard stepped outside a few minutes later carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "You're too young for coffee addiction," he said, handing one over. Annie smiled faintly. "Thanks." They stood quietly side by side for a while listening to wind move through the trees. Then Annie asked softly, "Do you think people really change?" Richard thought about Ray, about grief, about himself. "Sometimes," he answered carefully, "but not usually because somebody begged them to." Annie nodded slowly. Then she looked toward the warm light spilling from the house behind them. "I almost slept outside last night." Richard glanced at her. "I know. I really thought all I deserved was one corner of a porch." The honesty in her voice hurt. Richard rested his arms lightly against the railing. "Annie, people who spend years being treated badly start negotiating for smaller and smaller pieces of dignity." He looked out across the dark lake. "That's the cruelest part of fear. It teaches good people to ask for less than they deserve." Annie stood very still beside him. Then she smiled softly into the steam rising from the mug. "Well," she said quietly, "you gave us more than a porch." Richard looked back toward the glowing windows of the house where laughter had finally returned after years of silence. "No," he said gently. "I think you brought that with you. Sometimes the greatest act of kindness is simply making someone feel safe again." This story reminds us that fear can slowly teach good people to accept pain, silence, and loneliness as normal. But one moment of compassion, one open door, or one person willing to care can change the direction of an entire life. Real strength is not found in power or money. but in protecting the vulnerable, choosing peace over fear, and reminding people they deserve more than just survival. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.